Hello, I'm Barry, and welcome to Rusty Nail and Friends, where children and grown-ups can enjoy a quiet story together. You've met the two-faced nut many times, but I've never told you how it arrived in Morris Wainwright's garden shed. I think it's time I did, so here goes. The Tale of the Two-Faced Nut. Now, you did hear me correctly when I said earlier that the two-faced nut had a bad cold and had to keep blowing one of his noses. That's because he had two noses, one on each face. He had a nice smiley face on one side of his head and a rather miserable-looking face on the other. It really was one of life's puzzles why the nut had two faces, one happy and the other sad, who never agreed about anything. Then I was told this story about the big nut with a whip with thread, and decided that this must be the reason why the two-faced nut was always at odds. It appears that many years ago the nut was given the important job of holding in place a thing called the connecting rod on a pretty little steam engine called Jenny. You probably know that the connecting rod is fixed to the piston, and when the steam pushes the piston down the cylinder, the connecting rod sets the wheels spinning round, and this is what sends the locomotive racing along the track. Well, one cold winter day, just before Christmas, Jenny was asked to pull some pretty green coaches, all decked with holly and paper chains, and lit with little coloured lamps fixed around the windows. Each carriage was full of happy, excited children, and the little steam engine was to take them along the track through the wood to a grotto, where Santa would be waiting to give each child a present and ask them to write down what they wanted him to bring them on Christmas morning. You can just imagine how proud Jenny must have felt and how eager she was to show the children what a strong little engine she was. As Jenny puffed and panted up the shallow incline out of the station, working so hard that clouds of white steam filled the frosty air, the engine driver was quite unaware that the nut holding the connecting rod to the wheels was slowly working loose. It was only as they entered the tunnel that the driver began to hear a strange clanking sound coming from the wheels, and was soon followed by a loud bang as the big nut fell off and the connecting rod dropped onto the track, bringing Jenny to a shuddering stop. How disappointed the children looked when the driver told them they would have to be towed back to the station by a diesel shunting engine and wait for the little steam engine to be repaired before going to see Santa. It wasn't long before the engine inspector arrived. I see, he kept repeating as he inspected the wheels with his torch. Just as I thought. The nut's fallen off. Nut was still feeling dizzy, lying by the side of the track a few yards down the line. "Now see what you've done," shouted one side of the nut. "Me?" snapped the other side. "You were the one that said the spanner tickled and kept squeaking each time the engineer tried to tighten you up." "And what about the split pin?" blurted the other face angrily. "Well, you heard it say it felt sick going round and round on the wheel, so it didn't seem fair to force it to come." "But it would have just falling off, silly." "Well, you should have said," replied the other side, wiping away a tear. "You always try to blame me for everything." The nut blinked and covered its eyes as the beam from the engine inspector's torch found it, cowering beside the track. "Ah, here's the culprit," exclaimed the inspector, as he snatched up the nut. "All that disruption, not to mention the disappointed children, and all caused by one silly nut." However, back at the depot, the argument raged on. The foreman blamed the storeman, and the storeman said the manager should have known better, but thought the fitter was to blame, which made the fitter stamp his foot and shout, "What about the engine inspector then?" Meanwhile, the engine inspector kept pointing at the nut that he'd just placed on the bench, screaming, "If anything is to blame, it's this confounded nut." In the end, they all agreed that it was at least half the nut's fault, until the high-pitched voice of the apprentice boy chirped up with, "Yes, but which half, sir?" "How on earth am I supposed to know that?" snapped the foreman. "Both halves look the flipping same to me." "Oh, that's easy," replied the inspector, taking a felt-tipped pen from his pocket and drawing a big smiley face on one side of the nut, and a very miserable-looking face on the other side. "Now we can see which half was to blame," he went on, and they all roared with laughter. Except for the two-faced nut, that is, who never managed to agree on much at all after that. The two-faced nut was placed on the shelf above the station master's fireplace, as a reminder to the others that there is always a right and a wrong way of doing things, and to make sure you look at both sides of the argument before placing the blame. Jenny was soon back in full working order and continued to pull coaches full of excited children to Santa's grotto deep in the woods for many years. As for the two-faced nut, well, that was lost when the little railway station closed and a row of council houses was built on the place where the station once stood. One of these neat little houses was rented by George and Hilda Wainwright, long before their grandchild Morris was born. However, it was in this very garden many years later that young Morris would play with his first scooter and learn to ride his mountain bike. As he grew older, he would help his granddad feed the chickens and pick the cooking apples from the two straggly trees, and sometimes, when it was cold or raining, he would play inside the shed by the fence where he would watch his granddad repair clocks and old gramophones. Then one day his granddad showed him a big rusty nut that he'd dug out of the garden when he was planting his seed potatoes, and told him that if he cleaned it and painted it nicely, he could give it to his mum on her birthday as a doorstop. Morris chuckled excitedly and said, "What colour shall I paint it, Grandad, and can I paint a face on it?" "I've got plenty of green paint," replied his granddad, "and you can paint 6 faces if you want to. Look, it's got 6 sides." "No, I'll just do 2, said the lad, "a smiley face and a sad one." Some people used to say how attractive and unusual it looked, standing just inside the front door, and young Morris would sometimes turn it so that the smiley face was looking at you as you came in, unless he was feeling very sad, when he'd turn it around so that the sad face was staring at you instead. That is, until that awful day when the rent man tripped over it and broke his leg in 2 places. That's when his mother shouted at him for listening to his granddad's silly ideas and told him to put it in the shed where it couldn't do any more damage or break any more legs. However, the two-faced nut did have one redeeming feature. It did love children, and in the story that follows made everyone that lived in Morris Wainwright's garden shed very happy. Or perhaps I should say almost everyone. Although the two-faced nut was happy living with Rusty and the other friends, he never forgot his days on the steam engine, taking the children to see Santa, as you will find out in the next episode. So come back soon, and until then, sleep well and keep smiling.